Hey everybody, Mr. Reen here, and up to now you have been looking at how to write your design proposal, focusing mostly on the introduction. And today we're going to be looking at the next portion where we focus on the body paragraphs, where we really begin to show how our design is optimal for NISHA, the International Disaster Aid Committee, and the natural disaster victims we're trying to help. So in our, here we go. Design proposal, we know that we have claim, evidence, reasoning. We are creating a scientific argument. And this scientific argument is going to be for NISHA, the IDAC as our target audience. We're trying to convince them that our pod is the best and they should use it for the natural disaster victims they're trying to help. Our claim is the optimal design or the best pod design for minimizing all three criteria. So that's the pod that we built in our sim with all of the different add-ons, top, bottom, padding, and shell. The evidence that we're going to be using to show that it's the best optimal design is going to be things that we came across in our research and design cycle. So that would be our testing results. So what kind of shell condition, cost, and cargo damage we had after each drop. That would be the articles that we read. That would be the feedback that we got from NISHA, and that would be the testing data. So that would be things like what the impact force, mass, and velocity. These are all pieces of evidence that we can use to show that our design is optimal. And our job will be to explain how it's optimal for minimizing our three criteria together. So that's minimizing cost, cargo damage, and shell damage together. So with all of this, we have to ask ourselves, how can we use this evidence from the research and design cycle to explain how our pod design is optimal for minimizing these three criteria? And we're going to answer this question by completing the next portion of our proposal, and that is going to be the body paragraphs. So we already did the introduction where you explained what your optimal design was, what it's used for, and what its results were if it were dropped. And now we're going to be looking at the three body paragraphs that focus on each of our three criteria. The first one being shell damage, the second one being cargo damage, the third one being pod cost. We'll get to the conclusion later. So, how do we write these three portions? Well, for each one, we're focusing on the criteria, looking at showing how our optimal design, our optimal pod design is best for minimizing each of the three criteria, trying to pull evidence from our drop data, our criteria data, NISHA's feedback, and the articles that we read. So we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to use NISHA's feedback to show your design's optimal? And for one of the examples, we can talk about how it's optimal for minimizing pod cost. Same with our articles. How can we use text evidence to show it's optimal for doing something like minimizing pod cost? Our drop data, how can we use that to show it's best for minimizing pod cost? And our criteria data, how can we show that as well? So we're going to use this as an example to show you how we would go about finding evidence and using it as evidence and reasoning that our pod is optimal. So here's each of our four pieces of data or evidence that we could find. One is evidence from NISHA's feedback. One is iterative tests and the criteria that it have, comparing it to others. Here's another where we have our iterative tests where we compare our drop data to one another. And then we have our article direct text evidence. So starting with NISHA's feedback, we could go look at NISHA's feedback and read about what she said for our cost. This example says, you've done a great job, designing a very affordable pod. So right off the bat, NISHA is praising us as the mechanical engineer for having great cost for our pod. So the evidence that I could use is NISHA said that you're doing a great job designing an affordable pod. And this is where I would write my reasoning section saying, this shows my pod is optimal for minimizing costs, focusing on this idea that she's a mechanical engineer. She has the authority to decide if pod designs are good, moderate, or weak. And she is giving our pod costs a very strong result. The second piece of evidence we can use is when we compare iterative tests looking at the criteria data. So this, for example, is shell damage, pod costs, and cargo damage. And the evidence that I can use is pod 1 costs $2,000, whereas pod 2 costs $1,500. So notice I'm comparing the data here for cost. And just like with my Nisha feedback, I'm using direct observations, things that people can say, yep, those are exactly what those numbers are. Or, yes, that's exactly what she said. Things that are not disputable. And this is where I'd say, okay, well, this shows my pod is optimal for minimizing cost because, well, when comparing these two, I clearly have lower cost than another test that had maybe similar results. So this would be more optimal compared to other tests that I've created. Next, we can talk about iterative testing, comparing drop data to other tests as well. And if you notice here, again, we have two different tests, test 1 and 2, where test 2 has the top, 1,060 and 19 as the impact force, mass, and velocity. Test 1 has 2,200, 112, and 29. So here I can say pod 2 has an impact force of 2,200 and pod 1 has an impact force of 1,000. Okay. And what we're looking at here is comparing those two and saying, okay, well, how does that help show that my pod was best for minimizing cost? Well, I could go in and look at how I got, for example, the impact force down. Impact force is affected by things like my bottom add-ons. I could say that, oh, look, I can show that my pod is optimal for minimizing cost because I brought my pod, this would actually be pod 2 versus pod 1. I brought pod 2, my optimal design impact force, down by using some of the lowest costing add-ons. I used some of the trestles, which cost the least, and brought the impact force down, which got me very strong results. The last one is the direct text evidence from the article. This is where you can go in and use evidence from any of the articles to show that in this case you brought down the cost. So for example, the cost to make the outer shell of the pod is $50. And this cost is where I could really focus on how I minimize the overall cost of my pod. So this shows my pod is optimal for minimizing cost because the steel was $50 and maybe the aluminum was $100. So I was able to use a lower costing material, creating a better cost overall for my pod. So folks, this is how you go about using each of the 4 pieces of evidence to support your design is optimal for minimizing criteria. Your job will be to go in and do that for our different body paragraphs, focusing specifically on the very first one, using that to answer our questions with evidence for each one. There's Nisha's feedback, there's the iterative comparisons, there's direct text evidence, there's the drop results, evidence going in the top, reasoning going in the bottom. So go ahead and take a second. Do we understand what each of the 3 body paragraphs will be focusing on for the proposal and the 4 pieces of evidence you can use in your reasoning for your optimal design? Please fill out the survey, be honest, and reach out if you need help. Good luck.